Welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. And I have a lot to say today, but I have a lot to clear out first. I think about the function of platitudes a lot. What social function do they serve? Why do people always talk about the left should think about power without defining in what sense that power is to be used? After all, power is the ability to move, to do action in a very literal sense. Let's break things down to definitions here. So, of course, the left should be thinking about how to move. But one, it has had more effect on things than it likes to admit. I'm going to be talking with friend of the show and former protege Lukács scholar Amok Sahu about this, about the fact that the left often tries to disclaim its ability to do anything, but it actually has changed broader left liberal discourse. And this is not the first time it's happened. It's been a trend through most of the 20th century. The left reframes liberal discourse all the time and has it thrown back in its face. So, of course, the powerlessness enacted is a defense mechanism against the result, often, of your own ideas. Now, that's generic. That's almost itself a platitude. We could talk about this in a different way. What kind of power do you want the left to have? Electoral power? That's expensive. In discourse patterns, lefts and left liberals have both hit above their weight for a long time. Their discourse is sticky. Even when right-wingers come up with a countervailing discourse for the culture, they tend to use, appropriate, misappropriate, and demonize leftist terms. But when it comes to actually dealing with state powers, the left itself these days, in so much that left has any meaning, tends to do the opposite. They tend to instantiate, defend the institutions that are used against it. Now, this is still too generic. It's still, in some way, platitudes. All right? We have to get in and dig into what this power to act and do is. I recently got into a debate on the premier streaming chat with someone. It was not particularly fair, but they were talking about how the DSA should build power. And I'm like, well, the DSA is subordinate itself to an electoral party. Structurally, it's subordinating itself to an electoral party. And its electeds aren't really its electeds. They don't really have that much incentive or ability to be loyal to the DSA. So holding your electeds accountable is pretending that they are yours, which outside of New York and California and a few municipalities spread throughout the country, they're not really yours because you can't really generate enough funding to support them. The DSA can barely generate enough funding to support itself, given what's linking out of the Central Committee comparing to going into next year's conference. The convention seems to indicate that the DSA itself is in financial trouble. Now, what should the DSA do to build power? Should it try to hold its electeds accountable when it doesn't really have the fiscal mechanism nor the votes outside of any place that isn't already run by standard progressives? This irony isn't lost to some people. Benjamin Studebaker has talked about. Another irony that we can go into, that we need to go into, is we keep on talking about how labor is growing and labor power is growing, and we're seeing the success of the UAW. And I do think there are real successes in the UAW. I'm not here to shit on them, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics has shown that we still have not seen a growth and density in labor unions in the United States. It seems like there may have been a shift back from teachers being the larger public sector union than cops. But there's many anti-teacher union laws coming out right now, which have very little national opposition. No one's gearing up to fight in Utah the way they fought in Wisconsin a decade ago. So even there, the hope is stillified. Has Amazon United really built outside of New York? Not a lot. Has the Starbucks union won any great contract battles? Not a lot. The UAW success is tactical and also has come from an internal union debate, finally thrusting off a lot of bad union, but it's in a union leadership, but it's in a field that is not likely to grow. We're not likely to see traditional auto manufacturer come back and become the dominant employment in the United States the way it was in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And most of the people who work in the auto industry, tote court, are not in direct production like that. So what are you going to do about it? Like, how do you turn that labor militancy and this new strategy from the UAW, which is important, into something other than just valorizing it and attaching your hopes to it? That's important to ask yourself. And if you can't answer it, you fundamentally don't have an answer. So if your hopes are in institutions that do not have a strong success rate, what are you going to do? Well, in response to that, a lot of people come to platitudes like the revolution, the left is dead. I can go through the many things that seem to be speaking reason to people. They act as orientation guides. But a lot of this is just reactive affectation. All right. Um, and this is something that you need to parse. Like, are you always reacting to the last thing that grifted you? Because that's just assertion and counter assertion in the same person. And this is a broader problem in modern culture than just the left. And again, I've been using the left here as a way to talk about people who see themselves as trying to move the Democratic Party in either a more socialist or Marxist way, or people who see themselves as needing to move society outside of the Democratic Party in a more Marxist way, which necessarily limits what I'm talking about to the United States. Now, I'm not dealing with people who find their hope in other countries, although frankly, I think that is projected and also a similar cop out. Always hoping that someone else does your dirty work for you is very, very lazy and incredibly common. Now, you'll notice that what was supposed to come out today was an against emotivism uh, piece. Maybe you haven't figured out the patterns to what I'm releasing because I've never stated it. I now alternate series when I can on Varn solos, and they come out on Friday. The Nailing It Down comes out on Monday. The Radical Engagements come out on Wednesday and Thursday. There is one interview a month. This for the main show, and then we're going to try to have Bottomless Seas on the YouTube channel once a month as well, usually on a Thursday. So just to explicitly spell it out. There's still other sub shows and stuff. Diving into Wreckage is still going on. No Royal Road will restart once Chris is more stabilized in his current situation, having both being in a PhD program and just having his family expand. So it changes the situation. But I wanted to read a section of After Virtue for you. Now, After Virtue is not a left-wing book in a lot of ways. It's just something to think about. And I'll get to how it's relevant. This is going to come up in our Against Emotivism series as well. The most striking feature of contemporary moral utterances is so much of it is used to express disagreements. And the most striking feature of the debates in which these disagreements are expressed is their interminable character. I do not mean by just that such debates go on and on and on, although they do, but also that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture. Consider the three examples of just contemporary moral debate framed in terms of characteristic and well-known rival moral arguments. 1. A just war is going to be one in which the good to be achieved outweighs the evils involved in raging a war, and in which a clear distinction can be made between combatants whose lives are at stake and innocent non-combatants. But in modern war, calculations of future escalation is never reliable, and no practical applicable distinction between combatants and non-combatants can be made. Therefore, no modern war can be a just war, and we all now ought to be pacifist. B. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. The only way to achieve peace is to deter potential aggressors. Therefore, you must build your argument to make it clear that the war is going on any particular scale is necessarily ruled out by your policies. An inescapable part of making this clear is being prepared to both fight unlimited wars and not only to go to but beyond the nuclear brink on certain types of occasion. Otherwise, you will not avoid war and you will be defeated. C. Wars between great powers are purely destructive, but wars waged to liberate oppressed groups, especially in the third world, are necessary and therefore justified means for exploring the exploitative domination which stands between mankind and happiness. Now, we see here three different moral arguments. There's no way to separate those moral arguments from political arguments. They're going to be related. They're interminable. Each one of them makes sense on their own terms. There's no agreed upon terms of which you could to address them. So what you have is assertion and counter assertion about the meanings of all these things. If you accept any part of any of these assertions, you're going to agree with it. And your reason for accepting it is probably your moral or immediate inclinations, not any logical reason. Let's give another example here. Back to MacIntyre. 2a. Everybody has a certain rights over his or her own person, including his or her own body. It follows from the nature of these rights that at the stage in which the embryo is essentially part of the mother's body, the mother has a right to make her own uncoerced decision on whether she will have an abortion or not. Therefore, abortion is morally permissible and ought to be allowed by law. B. I cannot will that my mother should have had an abortion when she was pregnant with me, except perhaps if I have been certain that the embryo was dead or gravely damaged. If I cannot will this in my own case, how can I consistently deny to others the right to life that I claim for myself? I would break the so-called golden rule unless I denied a mother has a general right to an abortion. I am not, of course, therefore committed to the view that abortion ought to be legally permitted. C. Murder is wrong. Mother is taking another innocent life. An embryo is an indefinable individual, differing from a newborn infant only in being at an earlier stage of a long road to the adult capacities. And if life is innocent, then the embryo is. If infanticide is murder, as it is, abortion is murder. So abortion is not only morally wrong, but ought to be legally prohibited. I want you to remember that MacIntyre is a Catholic, but he's actually trying to spell out the different rational arguments here. I would go on to say that he actually is not mischaracterizing or misstating the moral argument for legal abortion. And you will notice here also that he has not invoked Christianity as the rule. Now we can talk about the heuristics of suspicion behind each of these things, but nonetheless, these are the assertions as they're made on their own terms. If you accept any of their terms, the argument does make sense. Why would you accept the terms? Probably emotively. 3a. Justice demands that every citizen should enjoy, so far as possible, an equal opportunity to develop his or her talents or take his or her potentialities. But prerequisites for provision of such equal opportunity include the provision of equal access to healthcare and to education. Therefore, the justice requires the government provision of healthcare and education services finance out of taxation, and it requires that no citizen should be able to buy an unfair share of such services. This in turn requires the abolition of private schools and private medical practice. B. Everybody has a right to incur such and only such obligations as he or she wishes, to be free to make such and only such contracts as he or she desires, and to determine his or her own free choice. Physicians must therefore practice on such terms as they desire, and patients must be free to choose amongst physicians. Teachers must be free to teach on such terms as they choose, and pupils and parents go to where they wish for education. Freedom thus requires not only the existence of private practice in medicine and private school and education, but also the abolition of those restraints on private practice which are imposed by licensing and regulation, such as in such bodies as universities, medical schools, the AMA, and the state. These arguments have only to be stated to be recognized widely as influential in our society. They have, of course, articulated expert spokesmen. Herman Kahn and the Pope, Che Guevara, and Milton Friedman are among the authors who have produced variations of them. But it is their appearance in newspaper editorials and high school debates and on radio talk shows and letters to congressmen in bars, barracks, and boardrooms. It is their typicality that makes them important examples here. What are the salient characteristics do these debates and disagreements have? They are of three kinds. The first is what I shall call attempting to adapting an expression from philosophy of science, the conceptual incommensurability of the rebel arguments to each of these three debates. Every one of them is logically valid, or can be expanded so as to be made so. Their conclusions do indeed flow from their premises, but the rival premises are such that we in no way possess a rational way of weighting the claims of one against the other. For each premise employs some quite different normative or evaluative concept from the others, so that the claims made upon us are quite different kinds. In the first argument, for example, premises which invoke justice and innocence are at odds with premises which invoke success and survival. In the second, premises which invoke rights are at odds with those which invoke universalizability. In the third, it is a claim of equality that is matched up against a claim of liberty. It's precisely because there is in our society no established way of deciding between these claims that the moral arguments appear to be necessary and terminable. From our rival conclusions, we can argue back from our rival premises, but when we do arrive at our premises, we cease, and the invocation of one premise against another becomes a matter of pure assertion and counter assertion. I would add to the point that not only are they pure assertion and counter assertion, but they are when that doesn't work, people start invoking heuristics of motivation, assuming the model of mind of the other person, saying the motivations for why they are making the argument, because they can't win the argument, right? So you are literally well poisoning at that point. Now, you might go, Varn, what does this have to do with the first thing you were talking about, the DSA and the UAW, and when leftists complain about power and platitudes? And I'm going to tell you, most of the platitudes are based on these abstract words that are orientations that we don't define. What are your human rights, really? How do we define who is clearly oppressed? You go, oh, that's obvious. Well, it's actually not a lot of the time. There are some cases where it seems to be pretty easy. Israel, Palestine, settler colonial things against oppressed peoples. But in other cases, and most other cases, which make up a great bit of the world's political and moral discourse, it's not so clear at all. The power imbalances are not that obvious. The sides are decided by proxy. The claims of right have historical justifications that are valid in both directions. How do you parse that? Well, frankly, most of it is gust of whining. But the thing about emotivism is that it makes you unable to act even though you don't ever shut the fuck up. You might go, well, this is an idealist framework for and why we need to get to material reality of this. And I'm like, well, maybe true. The materiality of this is a very complicated thing. But what I'm trying to get you to think about is that your first premises are limiting you. You can't act because you don't know how you would act. You don't know how you would act because you don't understand even what you're saying. You've accepted the premises of someone else, but cannot question the premises themselves. So when you come up with people who do not accept those premises, even when they're from the people that you supposedly valorize, you can't do anything but talk about, categories as if the categories are substantive and eternal. All right. Back to MacIntyre. Hence, perhaps a slightly shrill tone of so much moral debate, but the shrillness may have an additional source. If for not only in arguments with others we needed to reduce so quickly such an assertion and counter-assertion, it's also in arguments that we have within ourselves. For an agent enters the forum of public debate, he has already, presumably, explicitly or implicitly, settled the matter in question in his own mind. Yeah, I would say absolutely not true most of the cases. Watch how pundits waffle, but nonetheless. Yet if we possess no unassailable criteria, no set of compelling reasons by means of which we may conceive our opponents, it follows that in the process of making up our own minds, we have made no appeal to such criteria or such reasons. If I like good reasons to evoke against you, it must seem that I like any good reasons. Hence, it seems that the underlying my own position, there should be some non-rational decision to adopt that position, corresponding to the indeterminability of public argument. There at least the appearance of a disquieting private arbitrariness. It is a small wonder if we become defensive and therefore shrill. A second, equally important but contrasting characteristic of the arguments is they do nonetheless purport to be impersonal, rational arguments, and as such are presented in a mode appropriate to impersonality. What is that mode? Consider two different ways in which I may provide backing for an injunction to someone else to perform some kind of specific action. The first type of case, I say, do so and so. The person addresses replies, well, why should I do so and so? And I reply, because I wish it. But here, the given person addresses has no reason to do what I command or request unless he or she independently possesses a particular reason for paying attention to my wishes. If I am your superior officer, and the police or army are in a party or socialist organization, or otherwise have power or authority over you, or if you love me or fear me or want something from me, then by saying, because I wish it, you have indeed given you a reason, although not perhaps a sufficient reason for doing what I enjoin. Notice in this type of case, whether my utterance gives you a reason or not depends on certain characteristics possessed at the time of hearing and otherwise learning of that utterance by you. What reason-giving force the injunction has depends on this way on its personal context of the utterance. Contrast this type of case with the answer to question, why should I do so and so? And someone has said, do so and so, is not because I wish it, but because the utterance because it would give pleasure to some number of people, or because it is your duty. This is a type of case of reason given for an action is or is not good for performing the action in question, independently of who utters it or even whether or not it is uttered at all. Moreover, the appeal to this type of consideration, which is independent of the relationship between the speaker and hearer. It presupposes the existence of impersonal criteria, the existence independently of the preferences or attitudes of the speaker and hearer, of standards of justice or generosity or duty. This particular link between the context of the utterance and the force of the reason giving has always holds in the case of expressions of personal preference or desire to be served in the case of moral and evaluative utterances. The second characteristic of contemporary moral utterance and argument, when combined with the first, imparts a paradoxical air to contemporary moral disagreement. For if we attended solely to the first characteristic, to the way in which what first appears to be an argument relapses quickly to an unargued disagreement, we conclude that there is nothing to such contemporary disagreements but a class of antagonistic wills, each will determined by some set of arbitrary choices of its own, asterisk, are material conditions assumed, asterisk, asterisk. But the second characteristic, the use of expression whose distinctive function in our language is to embody what purports to be an appeal to an objective standard, suggests otherwise. For even if we suffice appearance of argument as only a masquerade, the question remains, why this masquerade? Why is the rational argument, which is so important that it nearly universally utterance assumed by those who engage in moral conflict? Does this not suggest that the practice of moral argument in our culture is at least an aspiration to be or to become rational in this area of our lives? And a third salient characteristic of contemporary moral debate is intimately related to the first two. It is easy to see that the different conceptually and incommensurable premises of rival arguments are deployed in debates that have various variety of historical origin. The concept of justice is And the first argument is rooted in Aristotle's account of virtues. The second argument, genealogy, runs through Bismarck, Clausewitz to Machiavelli. The concept of liberation in the third has shallow roots in Marx, deeper roots in Fichte. The second debate, a concept of rights, which has a Lockean ascendance, is matched with a view of universality, which is recognizably Kantian, and an appeal to moral law, which is Thomist. And the third debate and argument, which goes to T.H. Green, to Rousseau, competes with one which has Adam Smith as a grandfather. The catalog of great names is suggestive, but it may be misleading in two ways. The citing of individual names may lead us to underestimate the complexity of the history and ancestry of such arguments, and it may lead us to look for that history and ancestry only in the writing of philosophers and theorists instead of the intricate bodies of theory and practice which constitute human cultures. The belief which they articulated by philosophers and theorists can only partially and selectively manage a manner. Theorists can only deal with in a partial and selected manner. But the catalog of names does suggest how wide and heterogeneous a variety of moral sources is that we have inherited. The surface rhetoric of our culture is apt to speak complacently of moral pluralism in this connection, but the notion of pluralism is too imprecise, for it equally applies to an ordered dialogue of intersecting viewpoints and unharmonious melange of ill-sorted fragments. The suspicion, and for the moment it can only be a suspicion, that it is the latter which we hate to deal with is heightened by when we recognize that all the various concepts which inform our moral discourse were originally at home and in large totalities of theory and practice which they enjoyed a role and function supplied by context of which they have now been deprived. Moreover, the concepts we employ have, at least in some cases, changed their character in the past 300 years. The evaluative expressions we use change their meaning and transition from the variety of contexts which they originally at home in our contemporary culture. Virtue, justice, piety, duty, and even ought have become other than what they once were. How ought we to write history of such changes? Now, I'm not going to read more of the MacIntyre book here. This is just the first couple of pages of the second chapter of After Virtue. My point is simple and yet complicated. When you say the left needs to take power so that it can wield power to do X, you have to define power in a specific context and from a specific point of view of history. And when you say the proletariat needs to do X so that we can do Y, you have to define why, what makes the proletariat the agent to do that, etc. All this is just assumed, and it is assumed as a way of winning the argument. That's not a material force, nor is it a moral argument, nor is it an objective argument. It fails to meet any of those criterion. It's not scientific in the sense that it is not experimentable. After all, case studies of history have a probability of usually 1 or 2. The exact conditions that make them analogous to each other are very hard to establish and are usually only expressed through vagueness and abstraction, such as bourgeois revolution. But what is meant by the bourgeois revolution is often not entirely clear. What are its salient aspects, etc.? Similarly with things like socialism and communism. The way that socialism and communism are used today have the history of the 20th century, and no matter how much you want to LARP online, you cannot remove that from its context. We can't go back to 1917 or 1914 or 1905 or 1891 or 1848. Nor can you impose your context on the context of, quote, third world peoples. After all, the whole third world debate came out of a specific debate between China and the Soviet Union, of which you have removed it since the Soviet Union no longer exists. And also Europe is not, because, it's not part of the second world. And the third world is not this unaligned masses. No, the third world becomes a proxy for developmental cases. But even there, it's muddled. After all, when people talk about the third world today, some of the countries they're talking about are amongst the richest on the planet. They're just not part of NATO. So, what does that mean? You're going to have to figure that out. But maybe you should figure it out before you start talking platitudes about power. Otherwise, it's just gust of popular sentiment, and who gives a shit? Like and subscribe, share, and maybe grow up.